When I'm president, we'll not only roll out universal background checks and magazine limits, but we'll also require 21-year-olds, if they want to buy a gun, they'll have to pass a test and demonstrate that they know how to handle weapons safely and responsibly, and at the same time that they're able to store weapons safely and responsibly. We got to change our culture because, again, one mass shooting a day, that's not America.
Former Colorado governor and 2020 Democratic hopeful John Hickenlooper is making gun control a priority in the presidential election. Last week, Hickenlooper announced his gun control platform, calling for expanded access to mental health services in schools, money for community-based programs to end gun violence, and national universal background checks. He also wants the federal government to require that all guns are stored behind a lock.
Hickenlooper's proposal comes a month after 2 college students were killed in a shooting at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and 2 weeks after a Colorado high school senior died trying to disarm a gunman who opened fire in his classroom. Joining us now to discuss the 2020 candidates' gun control platforms is Igor Volsky, Executive Director of Guns Down. He's also the author of the new book, Guns Down: How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns. Go out and buy the book, people. Igor, great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Hickenlooper hasn't exactly jumped to the front of the polls.
He has not. Oh, you've noticed.
I've been watching a little bit, you know, and does that say something about the importance, like where Democratic voters rank gun safety in terms of their issue priorities?
Well, what we've seen overall, if you look at issue polls, guns comes in about number 3, number 4. That's higher than it's been in the past. And I can just tell you from traveling the country to promote the book, we've really seen that the center has shifted on this issue after
Is that for Democrats? Not to interrupt you, but number 3, number 4, is that for all voters?
It's for Democrats. Those numbers are for Democrats in those primary races. And, you know, I think what we're seeing in the country after Parkland is particularly young people, but also people of all ages, really have this issue in their blood and in their bones like I've never seen before. You know, they're not just fighting for themselves, they're fighting for their younger siblings, they're fighting for their future children, and they don't carry a lot of that baggage that a lot of us have from the 90s about not being too bold on guns and the political dangers, right? They view this issue for what it is, and I'm glad to see that Hickenlooper and Booker and Kamala Harris and some of the other candidates are now catching up to where these folks are.
One thing that's interesting is when I see some of the proposals your group is putting forward, the campaigns, as you said, they're putting forward, stopping murder insurance, demanding a change at FedEx to drop the NRA, and gun-free polls. These are not things that you generally discuss in gun control discussions. These are not at the, usually it's different bans of different kinds of weapons, background checks, magazine limitations, those sorts of things. Why? I mean, before we get into the specifics about these, why pick these? Why are you focusing on
those are campaigns. In terms of those are specific issue campaigns. In terms of the issues that the candidates are putting forward, we are seeing a new focus on firearm licensing, right, which is a step beyond just background checks. That's something we really haven't heard since about 2000. The last time we had a real conversation about firearm licensing, that is, if you're going to get a gun, you should go to a local police department, you should get fingerprinted, you should pass a test, you should pass a much more comprehensive background check. If you go through all of those hurdles, then you could get a firearm. Those policies we know work in reducing suicides and homicides. The last time we talked about it as a country was in 2000, when President Clinton included it in his State of the Union address. You know, we have the situation where about 87%, I think the number is, of Americans support gun licensing, but politicians for years have been so reluctant to talk about it because there was this fear of, if I do, they're going to call me a gun grabber and I will lose politically. And I think, you know, in the 20 years that we've tried to find common ground with folks, it simply hasn't worked. And so now you see these candidates asking for what they really want, asking for what we need.
Well, and even beyond the policy specifics, there's a change in the language and the directness of the language. We've got a little bit of Senator Cory Booker and how he's talking about guns. Let's take a listen.
So when I'm president of the United States, I'm taking a fight to this issue like folks will have never seen before, because we're better than this as a country. It's a uniquely American problem. No other country has this kind of carnage. More people in my lifetime have died in this nation. due to gun violence and in all the wars from the Revolutionary War to now. We are not going to give thoughts and prayers, which to me is just bullshit.
What do you make of that moment, Igor?
I mean, there you see a presidential candidate really speaking from the heart on this issue. And then Cory Booker grew up in a community where everyday gun violence has been a reality for decades, where for decades mothers have been afraid to send their children to the playground, to the movies, to school. After Parkland, the rest of America really caught up to that reality, and that's why I think you really see the conversation shifting, and Senator Booker has really led the field on this issue.
Now, what evidence can you point to show that you said additional licensing would bring down violence? I mean, Chicago is one of the most restrictive precincts in the entire country when it comes to gun violence, has one of the worst gun violence problems in the entire country. Vermont has one of the most lax of any state gun laws in the country and has almost a zero homicide rate. I mean, it's negligible. It's less than a dozen a year in an entire state. So where's the evidence that licensing is going to do anything other than harass people with a constitutionally protected right that now, after DC v. Heller, is pretty well enshrined?
Well, to be fair, it's not harassing. In the 9 states that have gun licensing, I don't think those gun owners are harassed. In fact, you look at poll numbers.
I can tell you they feel harassed.
Well, but
in a place like New York City, they feel harassed.
Maybe the folks you know, but if you look at polls more generally, what they say is gun owners support gun licensing at about the same rates that non-gun owners do. So I think that's number one. In terms of Chicago, we hear about Chicago a lot, right? And it's true, there are high rates of gun violence in Chicago. But
you basically can't legally buy a firearm in the city of Chicago. It's almost impossible.
Well, it's difficult. There's a license. There's all kinds of different, more stringent laws.
It's may issue, not shall issue, and they can essentially determine. Yeah.
Yes, and there's still, and your point is, but there's still a lot of gun crime.
Yes.
Right? And my answer to that is, part of the problem is that a lot of the guns that end up in crimes in Chicago come from out of state. They come from places like Indiana, where it's a lot easier to get a gun. In fact, we made a whole video showing how easy it is to buy a gun on the border and bring it over. It's about 60% of crime guns that end up in Chicago come from out of state.
And you know that's already illegal, right? So when someone buys a gun out of state and brings it into the state of Illinois, they're already breaking the law by going across state lines.
Right, and what I'm arguing is we need to raise the federal standard for gun ownership. We need to have a higher federal floor for what it means to own a gun, for the kind of guns that can be produced. Once you have that, then I think you get rid of the situation where guns are coming in from states with less regulation.
But you're already violating federal law by crossing state lines from one to another with a gun that's not legal in that state. And so I just want to know, when you have 300 million plus guns already in circulation in the country right now, and that's an estimate.
393 million.
Over 300 million in the country. It's already illegal for people to take them from other states into Illinois. How is adding another law that says this is going to be, what, it's even more illegal? You're going to increase the statutory penalty?
If the argument is you're not going to get every single person to abide by a law, I think that's true. We see that with every law. But what we do know from states that have stricter gun control laws, so places like Connecticut or Massachusetts, is once those reforms came into play, they saw significant reductions in gun homicides and gun suicides. Take a place like Connecticut. After they passed gun licensing, gun homicides dropped by 40%. That's fairly significant. Now, you know, there are going to be hardened criminals who are going to do anything they can to get a gun and will happily break the law to commit crime because they are driven by different incentives. But the overwhelming majority of people we know follow laws, because otherwise, you know, we would be a country in constant chaos.
So we are sort of in constant chaos, but let's put that aside for the moment. We have some of the specifics of Senator Harris's proposals we can take a look at. One thing that's noteworthy to me is that she and Senator Booker are both calling for executive action if Congress doesn't act. Senator Booker says he wants to have executive action to close gun sale loopholes. What do you make of that? And I mean, in a way, has President Trump, with his very aggressive use of executive action, sort of opened the pathway for candidates to consider executive action on things that they wouldn't have before.
What do they call it? The phone and the pen before?
Yeah, that was Obama. Yeah,
that was an Obama thing?
Yeah,
and
that
the phone.
was Obama.
The pen and the phone, right? Look, I think it just really demonstrates that gun control has become a big priority. I mean, you didn't see this kind of thing in 2016 and 2012. You can go all the way back. And by the way, in 2008, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama praised Heller when it came down, right? And so now you've seen this tremendous shift with candidates saying, this is such an important issue. We're hearing about this issue when we travel the country. And if we can't get anything done through Congress, we're going to do everything we can to move the ball forward. I think that's pretty remarkable.
Is this a way for Democrat candidates to outdo one another in the primary, or do you really think that this has resonance at a national level in a general election? Do you think that people in Ohio and Florida, by the way, which is actually pretty permissive about gun ownership, you think they're really going to care about this?
Well, I think they're telling pollsters they care about this. Certainly in the primary, people care about this.
Well, no, we know in the primary.
But you break out of the party labels and you look at general numbers. I mean, the support for making guns harder to get, for raising the standard for gun ownership, is pretty overwhelming. I mean, we ran a poll, I think, last summer, and it was somewhere, general numbers were somewhere in the high 60s. Even a majority of Republicans said guns should be harder to get. So, you know, often in D.C. we hear a lot from the NRA, and we think that it represents all gun owners, but that's just not the case. They may be the loudest voice in the room, but certainly as I've been traveling and meeting with gun owners, there's a lot of common ground we can find, even on things like licensing. And yes, maybe it should be they want shall issue instead of may issue. We can work out those details. But for gun owners to come together and say, we have a role to play in solving this problem and solving this national epidemic, I think would be tremendous. We still haven't seen that. Even though we know the support is there, or at least they tell pollsters that the support is there.
It's going to be very interesting to watch how this develops. Igor, thank you so much.
Thanks, Igor.
Thank you.
Always great to have you.
Next on Rising, you know where your phone and produce comes from, but what about your meds?
For many medications, especially generics, the answer might surprise you and also raise some safety warning flags. Public health advocate Dinesh Thakur explains more. That's next.